Hi guys, Sam here. I'm pumped to be sharing today's episode with you. I had the chance to sit down with Olympic gold medalist Gary Hall Jr. Gary battled past a T1D diagnosis in 1999, at which point some doctors told him he would never swim competitively again. Gary went on to compete at the 1996, 2000, and 2004 Olympic Games, representing the United States and winning 10 medals, 5 of those being gold. Continuing to inspire diabetics after the pool, Gary transitioned to a role in diabetes healthcare and advocacy, promoting promising research and supporting efforts to find a cure. Please enjoy my conversation with Gary Hall Jr. Welcome to the Game Plan T1D Podcast. I'm your host, Sam Benger. On this podcast, we explore the lives of athletes living with T1D to try to uncover what it is that allows them to excel despite their diabetes. Today on the show, it is my pleasure to be joined by Gary Hall Jr. Gary, welcome to the show, and how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thanks so much for having me on.
So, given the sheer volume of your story as a diabetic, as an athlete, in terms of what you were able to accomplish in the pool, and also really transitioning out of the sport of swimming and into the healthcare space, sort of serving as a diabetes advocate, I thought the best spot to sort of start this interview would be your childhood and growing up. And in sort of doing some of my preliminary research, I was reading that your father, Gary Hall Sr., also competed in 3 Olympics as a swimmer. And also there was some swimming talent in sort of your mom's side of the family, or your wife's side of the family, with an uncle and also a maternal grandfather being Olympians and national swimming champions. So when was it that you first sort of started to see that swimming was a passion of yours, and also that you were so sort of naturally gifted at it as well?
I learned how to swim before I could walk. My aunt taught me how, and she was a successful collegiate swimmer. There were 6 siblings on my mother's side. She was one of 6, and they were all successful swimmers. Their father, my maternal grandfather, was a collegiate champion after World War II, in the years when they didn't have the Olympics. Mm-hmm. So I had swimming on that side of the family. My father was a 3-time Olympian. He won 3 Olympic medals. He competed in the 1968 Mexico City Games, 72 in Munich, and 76 in Montreal. After winning a bronze medal in the 100 butterfly, he hoisted me on his shoulder. I was less than 2, and carried me around the pool deck for the awards ceremony. And so some would say that I was indoctrinated into the sport at a very young age. And we grew up swimming. Mm-hmm. I am one of 6, the oldest of 6, and we were all successful swimmers, most to a collegiate level. And so, when we would go on family vacations, it was always to kind of a water destination, a lot of snorkeling. And that's really where I fell in love with swimming, was the ocean. Swimming down in South Florida, in the Florida Keys, and in the Bahamas as a youngster growing up. I really fell in love with just the element of water as a life source, more than a venue to exercise a competitive spirit that wouldn't surface until many, many years later. But on my father's side, he was from a line of doctors. He was a third generation doctor himself. He took a year off medical school to train for and compete in the 1976 Olympic Games, and practiced 25 years as an eye surgeon in Phoenix, Arizona. His father was an orthopedic surgeon, and his grandfather, my great-grandfather, was a general practitioner. And after I graduated from high school, my father pulled me aside and said, "If you go into medicine, I'll kill you." He was very set up, as our healthcare system, everyone knows, struggles in a lot of different areas. And there was a lot of frustrations that my father experienced that most doctors experience in their careers today. And so to rebel against him, chose to go into medicine in a completely different capacity, and that was as a patient rights advocate, really kind of trying to get diabetes research advanced more efficiently. Did that for a lot of years, and as diabetes has become such a huge problem nationwide, internationally, diabetes focus has been a bigger part of healthcare in general. And so I graduated up through the ranks of the diabetes organizations and filtered my way into a broader healthcare delivery with these integrated healthcare systems. And so initially what was a kind of paid athlete endorsement spokesperson for pharmaceutical and medical device companies turned into patient outreach programs, platforms that would mobilize patient populations, get them enrolled in clinical trials, get better treatments out to that same patient population, and then also advocate on the part of youth sports. What kids with a chronic condition, how for a volunteer coach, how do they, how do we train these people? How do we bring awareness to the issues here to avoid exclusion from sport or discouragement? After my diagnosis, I was told by two doctors that it would be the end of my swimming career, and was able to prove them wrong. But, a lot of kids are, when they face, asthma or type 1 diabetes or some other chronic condition like that, they're just they're benched or excluded entirely. So that was a passion of mine. It continues to be. And, working with these healthcare systems to make sport a safer, more positive experience. I also work with a couple other organizations. That's the Aspen Institute Sports and Society program, an incredibly thoughtful group on how to make sport more widely accessible to not just the privileged, but the underprivileged as well, in terms of socioeconomic standing. And another group, the National Youth Sport Health and Safety Institute. And I serve on the leadership board with that organization, a partnership with the American College of Sports Medicine, and a new formed partnership with Safe Sport. And Safe Sport is the U.S. Center for Safe Sport is an organization that's addressing abuse in youth sports, something that was negligently overlooked for too many years. So a lot of different touch points between healthcare and sport, and I'm trying to bridge those gaps kind of in a diplomatic way at a national level.
Certainly. And I think perhaps I definitely want to circle back to the guiding principles behind your advocacy work and really what's driving what you're trying to do, because I think that's one of the more compelling parts of your story, really. But it's funny, you mentioned, and I want to return to the start of your swimming career for the time being, but you mentioned you falling in love with swimming down off the Florida Keys in the warm water down there, snorkeling. And it's kind of funny because I feel like that lends itself to a more sort of leisurely pace of swimming, but your career, you were a sprinter in the pool. And when did that switch and transition really happen to you from, lover of water to competitive sprinter in the pool?
Yeah, there was, I must have been about 14, and I was at a swim meet in Glendale, Arizona on a rainy day. It was cold, and I didn't really want to be there. These swim meets can last all weekend long, and I was entered in a number of events, one of them being the 200 freestyle. I dove in and was swimming, and if you'd asked me at that point if I was giving 100%, I'm sure I would have answered yes. But something happened in the middle of that race, and my eyes locked with another swimmer about 5 lanes over at maybe the 50-meter mark. There was 150 left, and something happened in my brain at that very precise moment, and that was, I'm going to beat that guy. He was a body length ahead of me, and I just found another gear, and started trying in a way that I had never really tried before, in a way that I wasn't really aware that I had.
Mm-hmm.
And so we slugged it out stroke for stroke, and I was able to just barely outtouch him at the last stroke of that race, and it felt great. And I think it was for 37th place or something like that. It wasn't for all the glory, or there was no kind of arms up in the air moment after that race. But that was my first real connection with the competitive aspect of the sport, and I immediately was attracted to it, and that remained the why I endured so many countless hours of torturous type of training that is required to be a world-class athlete. The thrill of racing and standing up and trying to beat the person on the blocks next to you became really what drove me in the sport and pushed me to such achievement.
It's pretty fascinating that you can recall such a finite, explicit moment where it was like that moment, you locking eyes with that other competitor, that was the spark that you needed. I don't think most athletes have that moment. It's more of a sort of a vague, this is what I want to do, this is what I'm passionate about. But what do you think, can you attribute that to anything, that moment where it was just a light switch sort of went off for you?
Well, I think that like a lot of youth, I think that I had some kind of teenage angst going. Mm-hmm. And I think that a lot of us kind of have within us a dark energy, right? Something that, and that's not necessarily a bad way. Think more yin yang, kind of some
sure.
Intertwined balance of positive and negative. Mm-hmm. That and so sport became such a healthy outlet in channeling some of that teenage angst and the daily frustrations that we all experience, and it became such a great outlet. And so they talk about I remember as a youth swimmer, encountering Olympians, and I had no thought that I was ever going to reach that level myself one day when, encountering these folks for the first time. And, they would speak about the values of sport, about instilling a work ethic and goal attainment and, getting back up when you get knocked down, all that good stuff. And, I wasn't really aware that I was absorbing that like chlorine through those countless hours of being in the swimming pool at very early and late hours of the day. But those kind of attributes, are developed, are honed, and in sport, and those were realized in that moment when that light switch went off. And made me more committed as a person, not just to the sport of swimming, but an ability to make that commitment in other applications of life. And so, all of that kind of feeds back to where that one moment where the skies opened up through that cloudy day in Glendale, and kind of said, hey, there's something about this sport thing that is appealing to me, and something that I connect with. I think that a lot of us live with that ingrained. It's part of who we are. And that was one of the biggest realizations for me, that competitive nature. And the noble try to find a healthy outlet for that. And the dark energy, that something that rawness that sport triggers, something so primitive in all of us that it's just part of who we are. And it was realized too when I went to the Olympics in 2004 in Athens, going around that city during the Olympic Games before and after, and seeing these incredible tributes to sport in both art and architecture dating back thousands of years, it was became very clear that, this is part of who we are, and sports celebrates all of those things that Olympians rattle on about. And
you were mentioning sort of realizing for you that sports was an outlet for sort of potentially, as you called it, like dark energy. And I think it's pretty unique for an athlete to have the realization of sports as a character molding experience while they're still competing. I think usually for most people that happens afterwards, but you also talked about some of the training that you're doing as a swimmer, and I'm always in awe of the training and the diet that swimmers in particular have to go through to be competitive. I remember hearing about Michael Phelps eating some ungodly amount of calories, something like 12,000 calories in a day, and spending upwards of 6 hours in a pool. Can you describe a typical day of training leading up to those 96 Olympic Games?
Yeah, I mean, through the close to 16 years that I was representing the United States on an international level, typically we train between 6 and 8 hours a day, and that was 6 days a week. And anything that's physically grueling would be included. It wasn't just back and forth in the pool. We would do a lot of cross training, dry land activity, core strength, some boxing, work on the track, and a lot of time in the weight room as well.
So walk us through really going to those first Olympic Games in Atlanta in 96. You were just 21 years old, obviously representing your country, Team USA. The Olympics has to be experienced as sort of a culmination of years of training, pretty much your whole career as a swimmer. And then in your specific events, you have less than 60 seconds, sometimes less than 30 seconds, to show the whole world sort of all of those years of effort and experience in swimming in that short little amount of time. What's going through your mind on the blocks as you're standing up there as an Olympian for the first time?
You're aware of the pressure. Everyone is. Yes, you've invested a lot of time and effort to get to this point. It's a great responsibility representing the United States of America on an international stage. You're aware that people are cheering for you, counting on you, and so that's a good thing. But it also can create a lot of pressure, and I think the first time out, you really come into contact with that, and nothing can prepare you for that experience. There are most Olympic sports, swimming included, nobody joins to achieve fame and fortune. You don't join the swim team thinking that that the odds are so stacked against you being successful. I don't care how fast your father could swim. Those that actually make it to that world stage are so few and are so committed and dedicated. And the talent pool is so deep, among that group. And so to make that into that circle of camaraderie is a tremendous honor in itself, and responsibility in itself as well. But it's nice to have other teammates that have been there before. That is a mentorship that comes through sport experience, and that's traditionally been the way it is. Those older athletes that may be a little bit more aware of the impact of what the Olympic movement is to the world today. They help guide the rookies, if you were, through that potentially overwhelming experience.
Certainly. Yeah, and it's funny. I'm curious to see during your Olympic pre-race routine, it's been noted that you were always sort of a guy to watch. You would shadow box, and you would also come out with sort of like a USA Stars and Stripes robe as opposed to the typical, Speedo or whatever sort of competitive gear was sort of the default. Where did that passion and enthusiasm sort of come from for you?
Horsing around in high school. That's where it started. We'd go to swim meets, and I was a super skinny, lanky kid, no muscle tone at all as a young swimmer, even through my high school years. I was such a late bloomer. I grew three inches after I got to college. So,
wow.
Freshman, sophomore year of high school, I was this gangly toothpick kind of character. And I'd get up behind the blocks and start flexing, like doing muscle flexes, like Randy Macho Man Savage,
yeah.
and trash talking in a similar way. And it was a funny thing, like that. At first, it was not meant to be intimidating at all. And it was just, also a realization that sport is entertainment, that we can't take ourselves too seriously out there. I've never had a problem with that. And so, it to help alleviate some of that pressure that I was talking about just earlier, I was able to kind of, what I thought, bring something kind of fun or funny. So that entailed, flexing behind the blocks or shadow boxing or whatnot, some of the antics that are involved. And ultimately, by the end of my career, I think people were intimidated. I thought it was more of a machismo type of chest thumping maneuver, and especially a lot of foreigners too. They really kind of thought it was unpatriotic. But I'll tell you another story too about the Stars and Stripes robe. That was the largest fine, I believe, that USA Swimming had ever given out at the time, definitely.
Really?
But it was breaking the uniform code for the United States Olympic Committee. Sponsors pay a lot of money to have you wear their outfit behind the blocks. And in 2004, which is when I wore the Stars and Stripes robe, it was the first Summer Olympics after the terrorist attack 9/11, 2001. And the Olympics being held in Athens and its proximity to the Middle East, there was a lot of security concerns for Team USA that we might be a target. And as a result of these concerns, it was interesting because for the first time, Team USA uniforming wasn't so Team USA. There was nothing that identified USA on most of the outfits. If it was written, it was written very small. They were not red, white, and blue. They were red, white, or blue. And there was no USA flag flown in the Olympic Village.
Wow.
And you think about that. Yeah, that was remarkable to me because they didn't want to identify what buildings we were in. And so I thought, okay, I understand safety concerns and everything, but that's taken a little too far. This is the biggest honor that any athlete can have is representing the United States. I mean, representing your hometown or city or even state is a big deal, but to represent all of the United States and not be able to wear the American flag, to me, that's a little bit crazy. It's going too far. So part of it was a protest to this policy and over concerns for safety. And so, a lot of people saw that and really liked it. More people remember the robe than the race.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. Did that rub off on any of your relay teammates as well? Were they getting into some of that sort of horsing around, or was it more strictly business for those guys?
No, it was mostly, horsing around. There were, people that were in on the joke, and we were laughing about it back at the hotel room after, in between prelims and finals or after the final sessions. It's something to joke about. I don't think anybody took it too seriously. Then, as I got faster and got stronger, then, I think maybe some people, it was distracting enough in a sport where margins are so small. So it took 21 seconds to swim my 50 freestyle, and 48 seconds for a 100-meter freestyle, which was my distance event. So I was a drop dead sprinter all along, and we weren't out there for very long. And the margins between first and eighth place are hundredths, sometimes tenths of a second. And so, you definitely had to be focused on the competitive aspect. Like, you couldn't compromise or be too distracted with your pre-race antics. When it came time to focus, like, there's no compromise on that front.
And I think, too, something we talked about just in terms of the differences between your two events in the 50 free and also the 4x1 relay free. What is sort of the difference in terms of the preparation for those events and also your experience as a competitor in those? I know, I don't have any experience swimming, but, I played football through college, and the camaraderie and the sort of the brotherhood of the sport is something that I always immensely enjoyed. What was that process like for you as a competitor on those relay teams, but also as an individual competitor at the Olympics?
Yeah, it's funny. People do consider, whether you're a team or individual sport, and a lot of people regard swimming as an individual sport. But the training that is involved for all members of the swim team, you go through the equivalent of torture. If any of these practices were, being committed in Guantanamo, there'd be human rights activists involved. What athletes put themselves through to get to that elite level. There is a team building experience through that. And then that is manifested in the relays, and that is where you get to step up with some of these people that you've trained with, that you have this connection with, a bond, and be able to rely on another, which is so important in developing the psychology of an athlete too, is that, we may at the end of the day on some races step up on those blocks by ourselves, but we have a support team behind us of trainers, strength trainers, chiropractors, massage therapists, nutritionists, coaches, parents, family. And, we represent, all of them as much as we represent ourselves, at least those swimmers that are appreciative enough to recognize that.
I think that's one of the topics that we like to sort of hammer home on this podcast, is the fact that as an athlete alone, but especially as a diabetic athlete, there are such immense support networks, even like you mentioned, for athletes in the so-called individual sports that empower them to excel and to succeed. So Gary, the conversation up to this point has been Gary Hall Jr., the athlete, and now I'm interested to hear about Gary Hall Jr., the diabetic athlete. And I'm always intrigued to hear how individuals who are diagnosed with T1D relatively later in their lives. I know from my sort of background research that 14 years old is regarded by some to be sort of an average age of diagnosis in the T1D community. But you were diagnosed in sort of the midst of what I imagine to be a very regimented and demanding athletic program where you're, in the pool and doing cross training, and you mentioned boxing and running on the track. You're eating certain amounts of food at certain times. All of this has to be even more so carefully examined with the added factor of diabetes. What do you remember from your diagnosis in 1999, and what was the mindset that allowed you to move past that sort of the initial doubt and fear and darkness and go out and compete very soon after that at the 2000 Sydney Games?
So there's no question I couldn't have made it back to the sport, certainly not at any elite level, had it not been for the team with Dr. Ann Peters, currently at the USC Keck School of Medicine. She to me was as important as my swim coach or my strength trainer or anyone else that was part of that team that was backing me and supporting me through this pursuit of trying to make it back to the Olympics after a diabetes diagnosis. Nobody had ever competed with type 1 diabetes at the Olympic Games prior to me. And, that's breaking through a barrier and making that diagnosis a little less scary for, future generations. That's a greater accomplishment than the Olympic gold medal. So, again, I just want to give that shout out to Dr. Ann Peters. There's no way that I could have done it without her and her team.
Yeah, it's funny. Her name is one that is, every couple episodes, one of our athletes is referencing Dr. Ann Peters, and obviously a shout out to her for the great work that she's doing in empowering athletes. But you personally, Gary, was there a certain mindset outside of the practices that Dr. Peters and your strength coach and your swim coach outlined for you that personally allowed you to continue forward?
Yeah, everything had to be changed. It was like learning how to swim all over again in a lot of ways. What I was able to do and what I was not able to do at that elite level and the necessary training that was involved. And, just trying to figure out the tricks of diabetes management through this very strenuous endeavor. The stress, the endorphins, the adrenaline, the hormones that are involved in exercise at that level had dramatic effects on my blood sugar control. So all of this while learning what a sliding scale was and carb counting and, trying to figure out how many units of insulin to be giving myself for an English muffin, and making the mistakes that you inevitably make through that learning process. There were plenty of times where I quickly had to assess that didn't work. Let's think that through again, that approach. What can we do differently? And this is, again, citing earlier those qualities that sport instills. That was something that I was already, ingrained with as an athlete, looking for those measurable ways to improve, and really assessing, right? Like, what could we have done better there to improve? And so applying that fortitude toward an aggressive diabetes management regime enabled me to really kind of keep it under tabs enough that, I could finally, get myself to the starting blocks and be able for 21 seconds or 48 seconds be able to forget that I have diabetes. I've done everything I can to take care of it up to this point. It's been in control. And you're able to just not worry about it for the duration of the race. But immediately after the race, you're running to that diabetes kit again because you to get it back under control for your next race.
Yeah, I know you mentioned being on the blocks and being in a sport where you're essentially a sprinter, like you would be on the track. You're going to undergo so much adrenaline, and we know scientifically that cortisol will raise your blood sugar levels. Was that something that you experienced, and did you have any tips to try to go about combating that, or was it just a general awareness of, okay, as soon as this race is over, I need to get some insulin on board to try to get back into a good range? What was that experience like in sort of learning about the effects of adrenaline?
It was dramatic. I didn't have anyone there saying this is cortisol response. This spike, and this is what's expected. It was a trial and error process for me. And I remember the first times that I got those spikes associated with the competition at the elite level, the stress that's involved, the pressure, the hormones, the endorphins, the cortisol, everything. My blood sugar would skyrocket just in such a short period of time. And it would take a lot of insulin to reel it back in. And I had to do it as quickly as possible in order to prepare me for the next race. If my blood sugar level was not in that target range, my performance was compromised in a sport that's measured to the hundredth of a second. So yeah, it would be life or death in terms of athletic performance.
It's funny. We actually had on our third episode, Jim Edwards. He was in his high school days, he was a swimmer that traveled all around the world. He traveled to Monaco, and he would swim on an international level and compete. But this was back in the early 1960s, and in his living with T1D, their game plan with his coach was that prior to his 100-meter, I forget if it was freestyle or what the stroke was, but prior to that 100-meter race, he would swim 10 100-meter laps to counteract the cortisol response in his high blood sugar, essentially. So it's very fascinating to see how that process has changed over time and how people are continuing to try to deal with the response to adrenaline. But Gary, you would also go on to compete in 2004 in Athens at age 29, which made you the oldest U.S. Olympic swimmer since Duke, and I'm probably going to butcher his last name, but Kahanamaku in 1924, where you went on to win a gold and bronze medal in the 50-meter freestyle and the 4x100 freestyle relay. Sort of after those 04 games and closing out your competitive career in the pool in 2008, having won 10 Olympic medals and 5 of those being gold, is there a particular moment, a race, or perhaps a relay team that stands out to you as sort of the proudest moment of your competitive career in the pool?
Winning at 29 and defending that title in the 50 freestyle from the Olympics prior. If there's a postcard moment of my career, it's that. It felt like the top of the mountain. Mm-hmm. If you ask me what race I'm most proud of, I'll tell you it's the bronze medal in the 100 freestyle in Sydney. I had no business being in that race, and that was just a guts swim. That was the bravest swim of my career.
It's interesting in a sport that's decided, as you talked about earlier, by hundredths of seconds. When you're on the blocks before the race, is it one of those things where it's really anybody's ball game? And when you jump into that pool, how much of that event is it executing a game plan, and how much of that event is just pure guts, like you talked about with that bronze medal?
Anyone who is in the finals at the Olympic Games is physically capable of winning it. The determinant at that point is between the winner and second place and last place in that race is guts and psychological. And there's a lot of psychology in sport. Walking into a ready room with the world's 7 of the world's other fastest swimmers, you could always spot maybe one or two that looked nervous, right? And you could maybe rule out a couple. But there were any number of other elite athletes in that room that you really kind of knew who was going to be there. And if you look, so to give you an idea how close these races are, the cumulative margin of victory for the 2 Olympic gold medals I have in the 50 freestyle was 1/100th of a second. Wow. I tied my friend and teammate Anthony Irvin in 2000 for the gold medal to the 100th of a second. And in 2004, to defend that title, I won by 1/100th of a second. Now, to give you a broader look at how small these margins are, 16 years later, after 2000, when I tied Anthony Irvin, he makes a comeback out of nowhere, becomes the oldest man to win an individual Olympic gold medal by winning the 50 freestyle in Rio at these past Olympic Games. He won by 1/100th of a second. So the cumulative margin of 4 Olympic gold medals is 2/100ths of a second, if you include both my accomplishment and his. The previous guy, before I arrived on the scene, he won Olympics back-to-back. His name was Alex Popov, a Russian. So 3 guys have won 6 Olympic medals by the slimmest of margins over these last Olympic Games. And so, even though the margins are so small, it's the same people that are consistently kind of making the medal stand. And the difference is not in the training so much. The difference is heart and soul.
It is really sort of this harsh dichotomy where you have these guys, all of those competitors at that level are putting in the training and the work and, the psychological work, the mindset work that you talked about earlier. And it all comes down to, those years of training comes down to, a fingertip essentially of a difference in terms of a reach. But it certainly appears that, you've had some gutty performances over the years, and that those gutty performances have then transitioned out of the pool as well. And you were talking about your advocacy work earlier, and I'm a huge fan of your work outside the pool. And you've worked with JDRF's Government Relations Committee. You've testified before Senate. And in 2004, you even won a humanitarian award. What fueled for you such a decisive switch from athlete to advocate? And what were some of your sort of goals from an advocacy perspective that motivated you in this space?
Yes, well, I was fortunate. Shortly after my diagnosis, a wonderful woman, synonymous with JDRF, Karen Brownlee, she reached out to me, and she told me about this event in Washington, D.C., where kids were going to go visit with their representatives. And that was the first Children's Congress for JDRF, and that was back in 1999. And so just a few months after being diagnosed, with no assurance at all that I could make it back to the sport at that point, JDRF had connected with me, had offered me a network of support through the grassroots advocacy work that a community does so well. And so I, through Karen Brownlee, was, I guess, inspired. There's no other word for it. The work that she was doing to advance diabetes research really had an impact on me. And then obviously, when you win an Olympic gold medal and you have type 1 diabetes, it opens the doors to a lot of different diabetes research organizations. And so I had this privileged backdoor tour of some of the most incredible science teams in the world. And that always inspired me as much as, I could have hoped to inspire them. Being able to see their commitment to diabetes research, that's a level of commitment that I was familiar with, in dedicating that type of time and focus to my swimming career. And, these people, ultimately will one day cure diabetes. And so, gosh, I was really, really interested. And so being able to go around and meet with these people and lobby on their behalf among our elected officials in Washington, D.C., or among, funders, people that, fund this research and invest in these companies that are developing better products to manage diabetes and to one day eliminate it entirely. So just making that connection, building that network, making those connections, that was something that I enjoyed doing and I was good at doing, and using that accomplishment in sport as a platform to open doors and open ears. I mean, that was something that was so rewarding to me. I just was always aware of that responsibility, that opportunity that we see, so often athletes fumble, that they could really inspire others and be a role model and try to do something good, and they just don't. And so, I embraced that opportunity when it came up, and could have never anticipated, as a youngster on the swim team, that I'd have swimming to thank for that opportunity. And just wanted to make the most of it. So, I have continued to be involved as much as I possibly can. And I'm so passionate about it. It's sometimes hard to find the balance. I have to reel myself back in. And I've got a couple kids, and I've got to work too. So, I can't any longer say yes to every request to attend, diabetes fundraiser or something like that anymore. But I see others picking up that torch and carrying it on, and the progress as a result over these many years of advocacy work, seeing changes to policy, seeing new devices available, and better medications. That's a great reward, but I'm not letting up until we have a cure.
Absolutely. I love the mindset. And Gary, what for you right now is perhaps, do you think, the most promising, either this could be a piece of research or a product that is either out on the market or in a pipeline type of state that has, you think, the potential to really make a positive impact on the diabetic community?
There is a trial underway right now at Sanford Health. It's called the T-Rex study. Kurt Griffin is involved in that, and I serve with Kurt on the National Youth Sport Health and Safety Institute Leadership Board. Kurt is working on this trial, and it's a stem cell application where they're taking the stem cells from the adipose, which is belly fat, and retraining the T cells or something like that. I never had the education to fully understand all the research speak that goes on in these labs and conferences that I attend. But I've been around enough to know this one looks really promising. I'm really excited about it. I think they're about to find out results from the phase 2. I try to keep my finger on the pulse of what's happening around the world on that front. Particularly interested in the stem cell research, though, and what that has to offer to diabetes and all other diseases.
Yeah, I always like to think back to when I was diagnosed back in 2000, at 5 years old, and just how far we've come, in the 18 years since I've been diagnosed is remarkable. And then you extrapolate that forward to think about what we'll be able to accomplish in the next 5, 10, 15 years. And you consider the rate of growth is hopefully accelerating and not decelerating. A cure is definitely somewhere on the horizon and hopefully coming soon, because we have people like yourself and other people who are promoting and advocating and working to find a cure and to do research that makes a difference. So you've accomplished so much in just 44 years, obviously in the pool and outside of it. What's next for Gary Hall Jr., sort of as you continue forward and, as you mentioned, navigate between family life and the diabetes advocate role as well?
One day at a time, putting one foot in front of the other. You get to the top of very, very, very tall mountains by taking very, very small steps. And, I'm just headed in a direction and putting one foot in front of the other.
That'll get you to definitely high places. I love the mindset. And we like to sort of close with a common question, Gary. If you could send a message to a diabetic out there that's struggling right now, perhaps they were just diagnosed or they may just be going through a particular rough patch, what would your message be to that person and why?
Don't give up. Don't lose hope. You can stay on top of managing this disease. And if you just lose hope and stop trying for 6 months or a year, it ruins everything. Like you can get these terrible complications that there's no walking back from. And, the damage is lasting. So even if it's for a short period of time, look, we all get discouraged. Coming from a guy that has 10 Olympic medals, there's plenty of days where I don't feel like getting out of bed. But you get up anyway, you strap on your shoes, and you go at it and get through it. If you have to get through it, there's better days coming. But don't give up. I've seen it happen too many times, and there's enough that can go wrong if you are trying, if you are staying on top of it and doing everything that you're supposed to be doing. And there's enough bad days involved through that process. We all know, anybody living with type 1 diabetes, that you do everything right and nothing seems to go right some days. But, deal with that discouragement and get get up and stay with it, and don't give up on it.
Absolutely. Couldn't endorse that message more. And Gary, thank you so much for coming on the podcast, and really, truly, thank you so much for being an inspiration to the diabetic community at large.
It's my pleasure. And, I don't consider myself an inspiration to the diabetes community at large. Just for the record, I want to point that out. I think that we all have a role to play in this remarkable community that binds us. Maybe it's not the best circumstance that gets us here, but, we are part of a larger group that is moving the needle in terms of better health and wellness in the United States today. And one day we'll get to eradicating this disease, this horrible, horrible disease, entirely from the face of the earth. And I'm very much looking forward to that day and being part of the team that accomplishes that. We're all part of that team.
I'm Gary Hall Jr. I have type 1 diabetes, and I have a game plan.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of the Game Plan T1D Podcast. For related content, please visit www.gameplant1d.com or follow us on social media at Game Plan T1D. Find your game plan.